Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're logging on from in the world, and welcome to the first Infrastructure Intelligence live event of 2021. My name is Andy Walker and I'm the editor of Infrastructure Intelligence. And today's event, Risky Business, I think is one that has never been more apt, really, when we consider the environment, the business and regulatory environment, the world environment even that we're in at the present time, particularly with the, I was almost going to say post-COVID situation, but would that we were in a post-COVID situation. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic continues to affect all of us, not just in the UK, but throughout the world, and has obviously brought with it some key risk and risk management related issues that all firms are having to grapple with. And today's webinar will address the issue of risk with an eminent panel of risk management, legal and insurance, and indeed issues management experts with me today for this webinar, which is organised as ever in association with our events and communications strategic partner, BECG. Just a quick heads up on some of the sort of ground rules, not that we have that many at these events. If you do have any questions for the panelists, then please post them in the chat and we'll get to them when our panelists have spoken over the course of the next 25 minutes to an hour. You know, we'll pose those questions either to individuals or to the group as a whole. Feel free to add your company name or organization name as you post any questions, because we're more than happy to mention you as far as that is concerned. Anyway, that's enough from me. Our first panelist is Bill Zerbier, who is a director of the specialist risk management consultancy Equib, who provide uncertainty analysis, and there's a very apt term for the current period that we're in, for organizations, projects and programs of all sizes. Bill's got over 20 years consultancy and contracting experience and is an expert in complex quantitative risk modeling and has worked on projects from £50,000 in value up to £10 billion. So I think it's fair to call him an expert in risk management, and I, for one, are really looking forward to his insights as we start this morning's webinar. So, without further ado, Bill, over to you.
Hi, Andy, thanks very much for that. Can you hear me? For a start?
Yes, we can.
That's great. That's great. So, just to confirm, yeah, I am Bill Zerb, and I'm chairman and founder of Equib, which is a specialist consultancy firm working in risk analysis predominantly in the construction sector. You know, from a risk management perspective, I'd like to talk about two main areas. Talk about effectively low probability, high impact risk, which one could say we're going through at the moment with the pandemic, and then how can we, you know, what analysis through quantitative risk analysis can we actually look at these issues, and how can we get better outcomes from understanding these sort of issues. So, first of all, focusing on the low probability, high impact risk, what I'd like to do is actually sort of bring in a guy called Bent Flyvberg. Now, Bent Flyvberg is an eminent scholar at Oxford University, and Bent recently has coined the phrase regression to the tail. And where he's coming from is effectively what we're talking about is effectively there's a lot of the you know, we always talk about risk happen, and it sort of tends to round the centre with regression. What we're talking about here, though, is effectively issues that are extremities that actually are becoming more and more prevalent. So we talk about flooding once in 100 years. Well, it's amazing how we keep talking about flooding. You know, so these events aren't happening all the time every 100 years. They're happening more and more. And it may be that what we need to start considering is that these events that were happening, including the pandemic, these things may come more and more often. And while it's an awful thought, we've got to be pragmatic about it. So what does that mean? Well, what does that mean? So just from a risk management perspective, when we look at what's happened in the pandemic, and we look at how we've dealt with it from a risk management perspective, there's lots of good things that have happened. For example, very, very quickly, I mean, PPE, NHS, a massive issue. Well, in construction, it was a massive issue as well. PPE, we don't talk about PPE now because we're dealing with it now. We're managing it well. There's other issues, behaviours on site. So when we look at how we're managing ourselves. So for example, when you look at sites now, you'll turn up and there'll be one entry, and at the other end of the site, there'll be one exit. There will be one-way systems going around there. And if somebody goes beyond a point and they want to actually walk backwards to go and cover something, sorry, no, that's unacceptable behaviour. Get yourself walking around the one-way system and going around there. And then taking that a little bit further, modernisation and modular building in design. So we talk about design. Well, what we now need to start thinking about, and we are, to be fair, is that we're actually now thinking about how we're building things. So when we design with safety in mind and how we're going to build it, methodology. And one of the main areas which we're improving on, we're getting better at, and which will help, you know, on a safety point of view, is modularization. So very, very simply, on a simple building site where we're building houses, what we're seeing more and more is foundations are being built on site. That's accepted. We dig holes and we put concrete down. But now what's becoming more and more prevalent is that we're actually building the walls, the fixtures and fittings, the roofs, actually off-site, and then bringing them to site, craning them in. And effectively what that's doing is it's reducing the interaction with human beings on site again. And again, when you think about the pandemic, that's one of the key issues. It's about human interaction and trying to avoid people coming into contact with one another. So what can risk analysis, what can risk management and analysis help here? Well, we talk about all these issues that we talked about, low probability, high impact risks. But what we need to think about is, well, what are those risks? How can we put the controls in place? And also, more importantly, be efficient with our allocation of our finite resources, as in people managing those risks. And through risk analysis, so when we look at a program, we look at the cost plan, these are effectively models of what we're going to do. And what we try and do is, or not try, what we do is we do the risk assessments, the risk reviews, we identify risks, and then what we do is we embed those risks into these plans, and you know, both plans and the cost plans, and we do what we call a quantitative risk assessment. And from that, it allows us to identify efficiently what those top risks are, and what can we do about them. So do we look at transferring? Do we take the opportunity that we can exploit and improve on the position that we've got? Can we actually design something out and eliminate the risk so it can't even happen? Or do we just put some form of treatment in place, or even transfer, or look at the ways of dealing with it through insurance? And so what the key is that we need to identify what those key risks are. And invariably, what happens is we come across these low probability, high impact risks. And those risks, sometimes what we do is we say, well, if that risk happens, what can we do about it? Well, you know, we can't use the phrase anymore, well, if it happens, it's a game changer. The project will change. And so therefore, what's the point in even looking at it? Well, as we can see from the pandemic, that's not really acceptable anymore. We need to take these low probability, high impact type risks far more seriously now. And going back to Ben Flyberg, Ben was saying that a lot of these projects that we're also dealing with are overrunning and are increasing and are going well over budget. And one of the main reasons is that we're putting aside those low probability, high impact risks that actually do impact on the program and actually do cause a project to overrun. So just to summarize, I think what we're trying to do is trying to understand what the challenges are through risk analysis and trying to identify what those key risks are and effectively put controls in place to manage that and mitigate the exposures as low as possible. And yeah, hopefully that sort of wraps up what I was trying to say. Hopefully that's sort of within the allotted time that you gave us.
Yes, thanks very much for that, Bill. And interesting to hear you sort of outline, you know, the kind of approach that you would take, or that you do take with clients. And I think it's interesting. You know, you mentioned obviously the C word, which is inevitable, I think, at the present moment, and we'll come back to the effects of that of the current pandemic on the area of the risk. Because I think, I just put a question myself in the chat for our audience. I think that could be looked at in two ways, really, because on the one hand, obviously it raises risk to a sort of a higher level, but at the same time, everyone's in the same boat. So you'd kind of hope that there would be more of a collegiate and a partnering approach, to construction projects in particular at the present time. But maybe that's not everybody's experience. Anyway, we'll find out about that a little bit later on. But for now, Bill, thanks very much for that. Our next speaker is another expert in construction law. Sheena Sood is a senior partner of the international construction law firm Beale & Co. Sheena has got more than 20 years experience advising clients on a diverse range of professional negligence issues, contractual disputes, advising contractors, engineers, architects, and surveyors, the whole gambit really across the construction industry, and advising them in relation to claims. She's also very experienced in conducting risk assessments for clients with a view to understanding their exposure, both as organisations and on specific projects. And Sheena works right across all sectors of the construction sector and regularly writes for a number of construction magazines, including this parish, on risk and legal issues. Sheena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy, for that introduction. I think it's actually more than 20 years experience now. Celebrated my 30 years at Beale & Co. fairly recently as a qualified lawyer. And I think it is probably worth emphasising that length of experience, because there's quite a large data bank of information in relation to the topic that we're discussing today. A lot of disputes there, a lot of claims, a lot of lessons learned. And I think one of the reasons why I do like writing for the journals you mentioned, Andy, and doing events like this is just really passing on that sort of know-how. There's no point handling it and keeping it in-house. I very much like sharing the areas of, that we have come across as a firm. So what are clients talking to us about now? What are the sort of hot topics? And there won't be any real surprise here, but there are broadly 5 hot topics that clients are talking to us about, and we are obviously talking to our clients about in relation to risk and risk management. Firstly, the contractual landscape that they are working in or aiming to be working in, the professional indemnity insurance market, COVID-19, as Andy's mentioned, Brexit and the trade deal, the impact of the trade deal is another topic. And then finally, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, fire and building safety is the other current topic. Obviously, each of those would warrant a session in itself, but just to really pick out the highlights as to what clients' concerns are and what our advice and recommendations have been. In relation to the contractual landscape, we are finding some of the age-old issues with contracts appearing, but being given new focus. That's mainly to do with what's going on in the insurance market. And I know Andy will come on to talk in a bit more detail about what's going on in the insurance market, but it is having an impact on contracts. In particular, around standards of care in contracts, there's always been an issue in relation to fitness for purpose type obligations, but we are seeing those more and more. Quite often hidden in appointments, not obvious, but there may well be obligations on those that are entering into those contracts to achieve a particular outcome, ensure that a program is achieved or a cost plan delivered. We're seeing increasingly back-to-back provisions or attempts to try and make contracts back-to-back with others in the supply chain, whether that's up or downstream. Limitations of liability, harder to achieve, and you know, there's a tension between a broad limit and our desire to keep limits sensible and in line with PI, professional indemnity requirements. And then one that's current really for me in relation to a number of cases I'm handling is just the very broad nature of the services or the scope of work that contractors and consultants are agreeing, and the wording of those services not being given the attention that they need. I've got a meeting later today where the client has agreed to undertake a comprehensive review of the project. That's one of its services, and the claimant on that case is pinning one of his allegations or his main allegation around that wording. So that's what we're seeing in relation to contracts. But on the other side, the PI market is hardened, there's less cover, and we're seeing probably three main areas where insurance is causing an impact on projects. One in relation to the nature of the cover. Quite often it's negligence only cover, so not wide enough to cover any civil liability or contractual liability. It's on an aggregate basis in relation to claims rather than an each and every basis. And there are wide exclusions, which I know Andy's going to come on to talk about. So risk management, what are we telling our clients? Some of this is not new. We are telling them to get their contracts reviewed or to review their contracts as against their insurance policy, importantly, to identify any gaps, making sure that the obligations under the contract are consistent with their cover, if I can put it in that sort of short way. Looking more closely, I think, than ever at their obligation to maintain insurance. Quite often it was a clause that wasn't given much attention, but I think it now needs to be given attention. What is their contractual obligation in relation to maintaining insurance? Obviously removing or amending any fitness for purpose type obligation where it isn't appropriate. And just to explain, the reason it isn't appropriate for consultants is because they aren't in control. More often than not, they're not in control of a particular outcome, and therefore they cannot agree to provide something which is fit for purpose, and certainly their PI insurance is very unlikely to cover them. Sensible limits of liability, that's not new, as I've mentioned, tightening the scope of services. But overall, it's about risk management, and some of what Bill has said is important here. It's about how you're approaching risk, whether risk is in the right place, whether it's being dealt with properly. Some of those issues are covered in more detail in my colleagues' webinar that they delivered last week. Will Buckby and Robert Reed, they delivered a webinar on the contractual landscape now. That's on our website, so you can look at the recording of that webinar at your leisure if you want more detail. I was going to briefly mention, if I've got time, Andy, claims trends. Just what are we seeing now, and what do we predict will be those claims in the future? And I'm sorry that this is sort of doom and gloom, but that's unfortunately the sort of information I need to share. I mean, the current claims do centre around the impact of COVID-19 and Brexit on construction projects. And whilst there was a great sentiments at the beginning of the pandemic about people working together collaboratively, but good behaviours, we unfortunately haven't seen a great deal of that. And the disputes are around who's going to pick up the cost of the delays, who's responsible for those delays. That's what we're being asked to advise on currently, and I think Brexit and the impact of the trade deal has also added to that list of queries. But in the future, in terms of claims trends, those that we're predicting, and I think some of these are obvious, but just to mention a few, home working, the way in which we're all working on, most of us are working now, we think has got risk in terms of, in particular, supervision of more junior staff, the inability to speak easily to colleagues. I think, in particular, in the construction engineering field, is a problem. You know, that there's a lot of interaction, a lot of discussion about complex issues and judgments being made that you just don't have the same opportunity to bounce off others. resource management, we're finding as a firm, it's harder to manage resources and to make sure you've got the right resources, sufficient resources, where, cover for absences and illnesses with everyone working remotely. Documents is one that's a concern in terms of control over documents, but also obviously security concerns with documents being in a number of locations. And the list goes on, but one that is quite difficult to sort of put a handle on is morale, I think, and whether any lowering of morale, I think we've all had our sort of up and down days, but whether any lowering of morale will result in a lowering of standards at the end of the day. So yeah, that's just some of the sort of things we're seeing at the moment, Andy.
Thanks very much for that, Sheena. And there's no need to apologise for doom and gloom, although goodness knows we've had quite a lot of that over the last 10 months. But I think it is necessary to outline some of those things that are coming down the track. It is slightly dispiriting, is it not, though, that some of those warm words around collaboration and around better partnering and everything else haven't necessarily been heeded by the industry. I would have hoped that wouldn't be a universal approach as we move forward, because really that's not really learning lessons, from the current situation. And again, you obviously highlighted there a number of old issues that have been given a new focus, as you put it, when you spoke. And I think again that's important to highlight, that some of the old issues are still there that people need to actually be given due consideration towards. But no doubt we'll come back to some of those and hopefully hear from our audience as well on maybe what they're finding in their on their projects going forward. Our next speaker, and Sheena mentioned the insurance sector when she spoke just then, is from a leading PI insurance brokers, Howden, and it's Andy Broom, who's a senior account executive with the firm. Andy has around 15 years of experience in the general commercial insurance market, and he's worked within professional risk and the related legal issues around that for the last 6 years. He's a specialist in the property and construction professional indemnity insurance sector, and he deals with many of the top architects and engineers firms in the UK, and indeed his firm looks after around a third of the UK's PI market for surveyors. So hopefully Andy will be able to reflect on the current state of the market and a lot more besides as he takes the floor right now. Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Great introduction. Don't need to go through my one. That was very thorough. Thank you. I'd only add on, we do specialise in architects and engineers as well as the surveyors, but that is a growing sector for us because, frankly, it's one of the areas that's seen a significant change in the PI market recently, perhaps more so than surveyors, which has always been a tough market. So I'm today just going to update on that market, move on to where engineers, errors and omissions are coming from now and traditionally. Once you've had a claim, you want your PI policy to respond. So I'm going to just go through the operation of that and some common exclusions and things that are starting to be applied in this hard market and things to look out for really from your current broker, which hopefully should be useful. And then finish with a bit on the do's and don'ts of handling claims in retrospect, in correlation to the PI policy and managing risk. So moving on, the PI market, as Sheena has said, has taken frankly a tank in the last 2 years. Last 2018 December, Lloyd's carried out a review of the insurance lines across the UK in the Lloyd's market, which drives most of the insurance attitudes in the UK, and found that UK PI was the second worst performing, non-US PI was the second worst performing class of business across all lines of insurance. And it had been running at 110% loss ratio for 5 years, which means insurers are getting 10% more payout in claim than they are getting in premium. Obviously, that's unsustainable, as you can imagine. Lloyd's got syndicates into line to create a rating structure that meant they could return profitability. That's happened over, I would say, the 2019 year. The result of this for you guys is, first of all, rates going up. We've seen 20% in some cases, all the way up to 200% rate rises. Reductions in cover, like Sheena mentioned, so limits changing from any one claim to aggregate. That's common now under design and construct policy. So anyone out there that's a contractor that buys a D&C policy will probably find that their limits aggregate. The contracts that you sign up to need to change to reflect that, because the market just isn't offering any one claim. On consulting engineers, I would say it's still possible to get any one claim. If your broker says it can't, then frankly, I think that you need a new broker. But it is tricky. Some of the other things we've seen are restrictions on fire safety cover, which I'll go through shortly, and consequential loss exclusions and specific cover exclusions on other activities. So where are the claims? Why do claims arise? Sheena's gone through many of them. A lot of them are contractual. Mostly it's structural calculation errors. They've always been high rated. Insurers also look at lack of design direction when passing on designs to contractors. Lack of correlation between different designs in the chain. Quite commonly, a sewage underlay map will not correspond to an infrastructural road map, for example, because there'll be an error in the underlying sewage mapping. The person doing the roads will still get the claim because they'll have in their contract a responsibility to check the designs of others. So things like that, you don't often think are your fault, can actually lead to PI claims. So you need to be vigilant. As Bill said, cost overruns, delays are really key areas. They tend to stimulate PI claims. Fee disputes, be very careful in fee disputes. They also cause a lot of PI claims and develop into allegations of wrongdoing. Lack of records is a key area that you lose claims. I've seen so many claims go the wrong way because someone just can't prove that they said what they said or that they've done what they've done. So keeping records is really key. These are all internal factors in your business, risk management wise. Exterior forces, obviously projects can be sensitive to delays in certain areas. So if you're doing work on a train station, what's that delay going to cause down the line? Excuse the pun, that wasn't intended. In terms of consequential losses, the train station being shut. So taking on projects that have a consequential loss impact is a higher risk that might seem lucrative in terms of the tender opportunity, but down the line could lead to some serious PI claims that could wipe out your loss ratio. So very important to look at that feature. In terms of sectors, all of the sort of sectors in the construction industry, high risk wise for insurers, haven't changed really over the last 10 years, albeit a few. So power stations, sewage, water, any heavy industrial, infrastructural, trackside rail work. However, recently we have seen obviously cladding and high-rise buildings come into question more. That's anything on your proposal form needs full details of that when you present to your PI insurers. Piling, swimming pools and basements have also seen a lot of uptake of insurers asking more questions and exclusions being applied. So those are some of the new areas that we're seeing, well, not new, resurgent areas that we're seeing people be wary of writing business on. The risk management side of how you prevent these claims in the first place are pretty understandable. You know, large projects obviously bring larger claims. Many insurers have a cap of 10 million for a contract value. So if you're doing projects that are normally below 10 mil, and then you start stepping into a project above, keeping in mind that it might affect your insurer's underwriting appetite. Multiple claims can arise from the same design error on, for example, multiple housing jobs. If you're doing a template design across 100 units, that's something insurers are very wary of. Specialist design, hospital clean rooms, things like that. Just things outside of the work. So you've grown quickly, but you haven't shown that the numbers of your fee earners have grown. Insurers will look at that on your proposal form and say, are you being stretched? So the presenting of the information and the explanation around the specific activities need to be really thorough in a broking exercise. And if your broker isn't challenging when you say, I do 2% railside work, they're not asking, what is that railside work? Then you're going to get the worst case response from an underwriter because they'll obviously just assume the worst. Once you've presented and got your PI quote and your terms are in place, obviously you want it to cover you in a claim. So most claims arise for me out of an expectation gap, as we call it. Your client will expect a perfect, profitable and professional outcome. Your PI policy covers, and what your civil duty in law is, reasonable skill and care in the performance of those duties. So the key point here is that PI policies have a key exclusion on them. This has always been the case. Sheena mentioned it. It's contractual liability. If you have a contract where you're signing up to fitness for purpose obligation, this warehouse will provide good tomato yields for the next 50 years. Sorry, I'm in greenhouse. The language around that means that it could be excluded by a PI policy. Your PI policy will only cover a claim for a fitness for purpose obligation if that obligation would have existed in the absence of it being in the contract. So if it's your duty under civil law, which is essentially about a lawyer saying, well, what have other people done in this area over the last 10, 20 years? What have other cases said in court? And if it's perceived to be a common duty, you're covered under your PI. If it's a more onerous duty, fitness for purpose, performance warranty, etc., your PI policy will exclude it. So in summary, do limit your liability under contract. Make sure that the contractual liability clauses, or sorry, fitness for purpose clauses in your contracts are not badly worded and not too onerous. Give your insurer a good defense, essentially, if a claim does arise against you. So making sure all the things that Sheena talked about, liability caps, not giving too much away in terms of taking on liability of others, that kind of thing. I review contracts for my clients on a daily basis. I have noticed what Sheena's saying in that the contractual environment is getting tougher. People are trying to pass on bigger indemnities and more fitness for purpose obligations. And it's your job really to get your broker or whoever legal advisors to review. Fire safety is a particular issue. We are seeing in the market now a standard exclusion for all fire safety in a building. So not only is it cladding, and not only is it above 18 meters or even 11 meters, these clauses exclude everything. Recent surveys done across the architect space, admittedly it hasn't been one in engineers, stated that 68% of architects had a full fire safety exclusion. Possibly more had a aggregation of cover. For most of our clients, we've managed to get aggregation of covers clauses, but we find that is shifting towards full exclusions, even for engineers. Engineers have only really started seeing full exclusion in the last maybe year or so, whereas architects have had it since Grenfell, frankly. But it's happening, and I think that's only going to get worse, sadly. So that is something that you really need to look back, and these exclusions affect all past work and future work. So needing a legal advice around how you explain that to your prior contracts, if you need to, and how you work in tenders with that kind of exclusion on is key. And I noticed Beal & Co actually recently provided a fire safety legal risk management service, which you can pay for. We obviously as a broker would provide that to the degree that we can, but there are outsourced legal avenues like that as well. So that's all I've got to say on the fire safety and PI policy operation. Other than actually a few key extras. Commonly, you will have a clause in your PI policy that will exclude claims arising under a collateral warranty if they've been assigned more than twice. This is something that was written out of PI policy over the last 10 years in the soft market, and I've started to see insurers not agree to write it out anymore. So if you have a collateral warranty because you've been involved in the design of a building and it's signed on more than twice, you might find that that purchaser, that tenant, if they bring a claim against you, you're not covered for it. Also, if that collateral warranty has any liability assumptions in it that are greater than you had under the original appointment. So there's a key piece of language where you can put in all your collateral warranties or requests that get put in that prevent that. And obviously we always advise to do that, which basically says there's no liability under this collateral warranty than existed as we had under the original appointment. So there's a couple of small PI exclusions that have always been in policies, but most good brokers have managed to get underwriters to write them out, and they're now coming back in, and we're seeing more about basements, consequential loss exclusions for basements, so the policy only covers the cost of rectifying work. And the same thing for swimming pools, trackside work, all that kind of thing. It's really important to get your broker to explain to you what an exclusion is if it's been put on, and do their best to negotiate and manage that out and prove that they've been to the market. On a final point, just some quick do's and don'ts on claims management. Your PI policy, like I said, covers you for failure in reasonable skill and care, but it's not just about covering a claim that arises, it's a circumstance. Many people don't quite understand when they need to notify their insurers. Your broker will provide a policy with two bases of notification on it. One is if something that may become a claim, and one is something that's likely to become a claim. So those are two different pieces of language that are quite key. And if you move from one to the other, if you move broker or if they move you to a different policy wording, if it's not explained what that changes in your obligations, you could lead to a situation where you haven't notified insurers because you're operating under the culture that you used to, and it's too late when you do, and they use that clause to exclude the claim. Essentially, legally, likely means 50% or more if something's likely to happen. So if someone is sending you communication that you've made an error, we think it's your fault, we think you should get your insurers involved, that's obviously likely. If it's a may, obviously it's a bit more wide, and you should notify a bit earlier in the process because you need to notify anything that may become a claim. We tend to advise operate on the basis of may, because it means that nothing's going to fall through the gaps. Moving from one to the other, like I say, it has been known to cause problems. Some other points, obviously don't admit liability, always get your insurance broker's agreement for any communications once you've notified an issue, and really just act in good faith in that situation, because a lot of claims escalate because the language and the tone of people tends to get difficult. And just be wary of fee disputes. Like I've said before, they can often lead to claims, and you don't realise when a fee dispute sometimes has turned into a claim. So always pick up the phone to your broker and talk about fees. I think that's all from me. Andy, is my time up?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that, Andy. I think a few key things coming out there loud and clear for me. The age-old exhortation to read the contract carefully is obviously important. Make sure that you have open lines of communication, particularly with not just your insurance and legal professionals, but obviously the other people on a project as well. And I think that's something that actually, everyone would say good communications is vital in everything that we do in construction. But sometimes it's often the communications that actually breaks down, either the face-to-face stuff that should be happening and isn't, and then that leads to complications, and it leads to issues further down the track. Again, we'll come back to a number of those points that you raised, I'm sure, in the discussion. Next up, we have a speaker from the communications consultancy BECG, Jenny Riddell Carpenter, who's a director at BECG. She is an experienced communications professional with more than a decade of experience, particularly working in our sector, in the construction and infrastructure sector, and leads communication strategies for a wide range of clients across the built environment, and has worked with some high-profile organisations in the past: Sainsbury's, the Co-op Group, Luton Airport, as well as a range of clients in the third sector as well. And I think if we had organised any event over a year ago, no one would have seen the COVID pandemic actually coming along. And if we're talking about allowing for issues that are arising that basically people can't predict, I mean, obviously, there's one right there for you. But I think one of the good things and interesting things about what BECG do is that they actually look at issues in the round when they're working with clients and try and identify all of the things that an organization needs to be thinking about that could affect how they do business, how they do work, particularly in a fast-moving and changing sector like the construction and infrastructure business. And then when you throw COVID into all that, as if the job wasn't hard enough in the first place, then obviously you've got that to contend with as well. But I'm sure, as Jenny will outline when she speaks, they've got, if not a solution, certainly wise counsel and help to deal with all of those risky issues. So Jenny, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for that introduction. So as Andy's alluded to, I'm going to use my slots to talk more about the crisis management from the comms perspective. So what do we do when the risk management doesn't go quite so well, and how do we manage the fallout of all of those issues around it? And as Andy's alluded to, this is a really interesting time to be talking about risk and crisis. Any business now, regardless of which sector you're in, you will have been working across risk management and been in crisis mode at some point over the past 12 months. It's been absolutely unavoidable. So from a comms perspective, people are far more interested now in talking to us at BCG about crisis planning and crisis comms than they were 12 months ago, which won't be any surprise to anyone. Prior to COVID, we worked with companies in crisis projects for one of two reasons. They were either in a live crisis situation and desperately needed help, or they'd previously experienced a crisis and understood the importance of preparation and how to plan and prep for better and learn the lessons from the past. So I don't have too long, but I quickly want to highlight two key issues that organisations should be seeking to look to manage, and then quickly outline some questions that you guys should be considering internally and questions you should be asking within your organisation, including also asking to your own comms teams and the teams that surround it. So first off, the risks to be considering. And I think the first amongst these is watch out for the risks that evolve. These are the risks that you don't necessarily see. They're not right in front and centre. And they're a risk that start off and they might be seen as a risk, but they evolve into a different risk than they currently are. And at the moment, we can point to a few issues that are evolving. We've obviously got COVID. It started off as one risk, but it's evolving into a second and a third and a fourth set of different risks that come with it and different crises that are attached to it. But more specifically, and Andrew alluded to this earlier, the risk of fire safety and build quality. So we know that's an issue that's affecting housing and construction sectors. It's absolutely dominating the media and political landscape. We know this is an issue that's not going away anytime soon, and it's a significant area of focus for us at BCG too. For the foreseeable, and we're just about to launch a new dedicated building safety unit to give greater focus to this. It's something that we've been deeply involved in for the past 2 years, working on numerous residential fire projects, building quality projects, managing at scale nationally build quality and a whole host of fire safety issues as well. But we're going to see this issue transcend other sectors. We're going to see it gradually evolve from what is currently a fire safety risk for the resi sector into something that stretches out beyond just the resi sector, and it will have a greater influence and a greater spotlight, if you like, in the media, in the political landscapes as we move through it. So whilst at the moment the debate around cladding, fire safety is limited to high-rise resi, it's absolutely going to start to move in the coming months and into the years ahead. Into hospitals, to public buildings, schools, and other non-resi sectors. And I think we need to be ready for that, preemptively prepare for it, and not wait for it to hit the media landscape before it hits business preparedness. And that includes having things like lines to take, risk management that's absolutely aligned to that evolving issue. Secondly, we need to understand from a comms perspective that social norms and ethical paradigms shift. Our external world completely changes, and we as organisations need to be ready to move and be aligned to those changes when they come. Now, this shift in itself isn't a cause for concern. Every decade, the paradigm and cultural norms evolve. But what's been really different over the last 2-3 years is that when this shift has been exceptionally bumpy and everyone's felt it. And because of this, unlike in other prior decades, we've perhaps seen greater social unrest. And we've seen this have a really quick impact on how public bodies and organisations have had to interact, and where they failed to interact, how they've lost part of their reputation as part of that. So whether it be Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the climate emergency, these have all been topics that have absolutely drawn organisations in if they haven't been seen to react well, and they've set the public tone, and they've set the media and the political landscape, which we all sit within, our organisations sit within. So it's just a case of making sure that you're aligned to those risks and you're internally questioning how your organisation sits within that, whether it's challenging it or supporting it, and where are you at the moment, and where do you look to be in the future. And then thirdly, risks to look out for. You need to really understand and consider all the operational risks, and this won't be news, but it always needs repeating that we need to consider technological risks, environmental risks, financial, human resources. Never underestimate the power of people doing things in private that drag your own organisation into disrepute. It happens all the time, and we always say it will never happen here. And the amount of clients that I've worked with that have said that then have been dragged into crisis just from a personnel or an operational technological issue that's then dominated their entire reputation, their ability to perform business as usual. It's incredible how often that comes up. So secondly, I just want to talk through things that you should be talking to your comms teams about, things that you should be asking for your own business preparedness when you're looking at risk management, making sure that you're absolutely embedding the comms aspects into it. And I've got 5 key questions that you want to be putting to your organisation. One is, and firstly, it's the easiest one, have you had a crisis previously? If so, what was it? What did your organisation do? What went well? What didn't go well? What have you learned from it? And what do you do now that's differently? And can you publicly attest to things that you've learned from it and things that you did differently because of the change or the crisis that you've been through? And if the answer to that question is nothing, then I don't need to tell you that you've got a problem, and you should be looking at it and you should be planning it and you should be absolutely learning from the history and your past to prepare for crisis in the future. Number 2, who are your key figures in the business? Are they good public speakers? Are they seen as competent, confident, clear and concise, the 4 C's? If the answer is no, then you need to do something about that. You need to invest in training. Or if some people just are never going to be the best public speakers, but they might be the best internal leaders. So can you identify someone else within your organisation at senior level who should be the face of your organisation if you hit troubled waters? And ideally you want those people to be trained, ready and able to speak in front of the crisis. So get in there, get in early and get training through. Thirdly, have you risk mapped your organisational risks recently? And this goes back to my earlier point around considering the operational risks, the technological, environmental, etc. But when you do your risk mapping, rather than, we see this so often, rather than going into specific issues and events that could happen, group it by themes, because you can waste time trying to think of every different scenario and every different situation that can happen. But if you group it in themes, so environmental, technological, finance and funding, HR and employment, disaster management, personnel management, and that your response, usually, give or take a few tweaks when you're in crisis mode, will largely be the same by theme. So rather than wasting time trying to say, had we planned for a pandemic? And most organisations would have said no, they hadn't planned for a national lockdown pandemic, but they could have planned for a national health crisis or something to that extent. But if you take it thematically, you're far better use of time and strategic resources. Fourthly, and this is where it gets into more granular comms aspect, understand, ask if your group audiences, your stakeholders essentially, across all your different audience groups, ask if they've been mapped and have you got your channels ready to go for engagement. Stakeholders frequently change, media frequently move around. Our customers and supply chains often are the strongest communication routes that we have, because we know our customers, we know our supply chain, we're talking to them daily. But the media landscape, the wider community stakeholders, the political stakeholders, they come and go, and often we neglect them. We might spend, I see so many organisations, in-house teams map and engage with stakeholders, and then 5 years later say it's fine, it's done. But obviously 5 years later, you'll have had you might have had local elections, you certainly would have expect anywhere up to 75% of those stakeholders to be completely different to what they were 5 years ago. So don't take for granted that you've done your mapping in the past. Make sure you're on top of it and you know who they are. I think one of the key points there is when the crisis does hit, it's not, your response has to be 0 to 160 seconds. You haven't got time to start to think who your stakeholders are, Google them, map them. You just haven't got time for that. So it absolutely is about clear, concise and quick responses. And then finally, and most importantly, and I'll end on this point, is build relationships in good times, because you'll need that trust in bad times. Invest in, so the question that you need to be posing your comms team is, what is the strength of relationship with your stakeholders? So have they been mapped, and what is the strength of that relationship? Have we engaged with them? Do our local political stakeholders, constituency MPs, ward councillors, council leaders, policy leads within MHCLG or wherever it is, what is the strength of that relationship? Have we got trust there? Can we build and enhance that trust? Because as soon as we hit crisis mode, that trust is what's going to get you through the short, the medium and the long term. And it's the bank that you need. And without it, you won't be able to sustain a crisis response and build a reputation out of it unless you've got the goodwill and trust of stakeholders around you.
Thanks very much indeed, Jenny, for those points. I particularly like that 5 key areas that people need to consider in relation to preparing for, because that's what it's about at the end of the day, risk and those areas of business that could actually cause you issues going forward. And I think it's interesting as well, the stakeholder mapping, which can sound a little bit kind of dull really, and not be at the top of people's list of things to do, but actually you can't exist without having stakeholders. I mean, it's just another name for the people that you work with, that interact on your business. And actually, if there's one thing that the last 10 months has taught us, is that you need those people, that you need those contacts, and they're there potentially to actually help you as well. And I think about building relationships in good times is absolutely spot on. But I also think that in the challenging times that we've been through, I'm sure that many organisations as well have actually enhanced those relationships, and even, dare I say it, built new ones as well. That's not to say that you don't need to build on what you've already got, but actually there's loads of examples that I could think of organisations that people have forged relationships with during the course of this period, which potentially will be relationships, forever, really. And I think that's, really heartening to see as well. Anyway, that's enough from me. We've now got quite a number of questions actually to look at. So I'm going to start off with a particular question for the whole of the panel actually, to begin with, and I hope it's reasonably sort of relevant given the situation that we're in. Obviously, during the COVID pandemic situation, infrastructure firms are increasingly embracing the opportunity that digital solutions offer across the board. I mean, obviously, with the majority of our workforces working from home or working from remotely, it couldn't be anything else really. But how is that affecting, in your opinion, the risk arena? Are there any specific things that people need to be aware of in this new digital age? Without getting too doom and gloom about it, presumably there's some positives involved in that as well. So if we kick off that one first, I'll go to Sheena to reflect on that. The increased digital environment. How is that working out?
What we've been seeing probably for the last 5 years, if not a little bit longer than that, is clients, consultant clients and contractor clients increasingly using digital delivery on their projects in one form or another, whether it's BIM or whether it's advanced BIM or some other software integrated within their business that they are delivering as part of their service. And that, as you say, Andy, has moved forward at pace. I think I read a headline that we've advanced in this short period of the COVID pandemic beginning. We've advanced in terms of digitalization some 5 years or more in the space of this time. One impact that we think it's important to be aware of is what your contract looks like given that. We have seen too many contracts not brought up to date to deal with the fact that now your services as a contractor or a consultant are no longer just traditional. You could be providing software as a service. You could actually be described as an IT consultant rather than a design consultant. And so what we've been working hard to do is to make sure that the contracts reflect properly the service that you're providing. And it's a risk management point, because if you don't get your contract right and it doesn't describe your services accurately and doesn't deal with the different risks that arise from that kind of service, there will be a problem when it comes to actually applying that contract. So that's one impact from a legal point of view that we think is important to bear in mind with the digitalization of what we're all doing.
Okay, thanks for that, Sheena. Andy, what's your reflection on that, about the increased digitization and what that's bringing up from, in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, well, it's a big talking point in the insurance world at the moment. Obviously, with the working from home, that's added something to what was already a digitization in the construction industry with BIM and other design tools. What's happening in the insurance world at the moment makes it even more pertinent to look at your insurance program and purchase what we call the cyber liability policy. The reason for that is across the insurance market, there's always been a grey area about what cyber risks are covered under a cyber liability policy, which is there to not only cover your own losses if there's a cyber issue such as your systems failure, a hacking attack, but also the third party liability if that is created. So you send an email to someone with designs on and that infects their system. PI policies, there's always been hidden cyber cover that would pick up that element of the loss, the same on directors and officers or management liability insurances. The insurance industry has wanted to create a firewall between those policies and make sure that a cyber policy covers what it's been invented for, which is that. So you will start to see, and we are starting to see, many cyber liability exclusions on a PI policy and a D&O renewal. So that's something really key to look out for. Your broker should be able, again, on your PI renewal to discuss the ramifications. Because it's early days, the problem is we're seeing lots of different insurers impose different clauses. Some of them are incredibly widely worded, stupidly worded in my view. We've created our own versions of what a common clause is in the PI market, for example, which is known as the IUA clause. And that should be tight enough to do what it's meant to do, which is still allow a PI claim to be covered, but force the cyber risk onto a cyber liability policy. So not the time people want to be buying new insurances if they don't already. I appreciate that. Unfortunately, it is creating a potential uninsured risk. So yeah, I would advise discuss cyber liability with your broker.
Thanks, Andy. Bill, what's your thoughts on the increase in use of digital and what that means for the risk environment?
I mean, from a business perspective, we've always been set up. So we've always, as a business, all our staff have always been set up anyway to work from home. So we've had all the tools, everything's been there for us. So from a working perspective, we haven't changed a great deal. I think what we are noticing actually, which Sheena talked about in her presentation, was the softer side of things. Is that, I mean, whether the terminology touching the flesh is the correct terminology to use these days, but the reality is that we like to get out there, we like to speak to people, and as Sheena was saying, you know, just sitting down and having, I'm trying to think of another better word than the banter, and just really getting that personal side of things. So I think from a risk perspective, we do work on major projects, and what we do is we're part of a project team. And certainly what I noticed when I was going down to one of the big projects in the country, which I was going down to once or twice a week back in sort of June, July, August, was that 1 or 2 days I was actually on site, the amount of information that I generated from that visit was probably equivalent to something like 3 or 4 days of actually being at home working where we are now. So I think there's a lot of good that's come out of it, and I absolutely totally buy into that. But I think there's a balance, and what that balance is, I'm not sure, depending on what industry you're in. And I think that's where I'm coming from, really.
Thanks, Bill. Jenny, from your perspective, you know, the fact that we have got people who are not working in the office anymore, they're in their own working environments, their home working environments. You know, maybe it's more difficult sometimes to manage people who are working in that kind of situation. What's your take on all of that and the digital, the potential increase in digital risks?
I think it's really interesting, isn't it? I think we'll see in how all this plays out and what the long-term impact is of it. I think I agree with what the panelists have said so far, is that in terms of morale, in terms of managing teams, in terms of people and the young graduates that are coming in and learning and upskilling, there's huge issues there to be managing in the short and long term if we carry on working remotely. There are huge benefits that come from working in this environment if we manage it properly. But there are obviously huge risks that absolutely need managing. When you have a physical workplace and people physically travel into the office and they spend 9 to 5:30 in that office, you have control of your resources, you have control of the people around you. When they're working across the country in their homes, you have so little control of what they're doing when they're a second away from their computer. And there's so many reputational risks that we've seen play out in terms of people filming on Zoom, and everything's now recorded. Even if you're having an internal Teams meeting, it's recorded and stuff can go viral within a split second. Whereas before, if you're having a meeting in the office, it's a meeting behind closed doors and it's not being captured, it's not being recorded, but now everything is there and it's recorded, whether it's on email or on a team or Zoom call, it's there and it can slip out in a second. And that's a risk that we haven't really seen play out hugely, but it's there and it's something to be so aware of, and the issues that come with that. Definitely we need to update our policies and procedures internally to make sure that we're managing that risk for the long term.
I think that's a really interesting one, actually. I mean, anyone can, a cursory sort of search of Google and you can see, sort of Zoom disasters and stuff like that. People are, walking around with pajama bottoms on and all the rest of it. I mean, obviously, we're only got the top half of our screen shown here, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you'll never know. But anyway,
really quickly to that as well. If you think about managing really tricky HR issues, previously they would have been in private rooms, and the only record of the meeting would be on minutes. And so when you're managing really sensitive stuff, previously it would just be the minuted action note that was circulated afterwards. Whereas now, when you're managing sensitive issues, if each party in that meeting isn't happy, there's a recording that can be circulated, and there's stuff that before the risk attached to it was so much lower, whereas now it's obviously so much higher.
Well, it's interesting, and people can watch this on our YouTube channel, which is linked from the Infrastructure Intelligence website. We did a communications within the COVID environment, and we had a really interesting speaker, Derek Arden, who spoke about how you actually negotiate and run sensitive, discussions, in a virtual environment. I found that really fascinating insight into exactly the point that Jenny's just raised. But doesn't that as well, though, speak to, I suppose, the construction and infrastructure sector as well? Because I would imagine now that there are many difficult discussions taking place, legal discussions taking place, all online, all of which are recorded. And is that changing the way that sort of process works? Sheena, from your perspective, where maybe you'd have a meeting and, as Jenny said, it's only minutes being taken. Now it's all on tape or whatever passes for tape in this digital age. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, obviously, what surrounds legal issues is a need for confidentiality. It's absolutely essential. And that's whatever forum, whether it's meetings within a client case, or whether it's a mediation or indeed some court hearings. But I think my own view is I hear what others are saying about recordings, but I certainly, unless it's really appropriate, such as this event, for it to be recorded, I certainly wouldn't agree. I wouldn't be agreeing to any meeting being recorded. I have to say, it's increasingly almost expected that a meeting will be recorded. Whether that's laziness because they've got the recording and therefore no one needs to bother taking a note or an action list, I don't know. But when I've been asked, can a meeting be recorded? I've said no, because I don't think it's appropriate really for some meetings to be recorded. And I think there's a real danger with that in a legal environment, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the actual meeting can tell you whether you're being recorded. Equally, if it's just going through a laptop, you could just put the volume on and tape it with a handheld device. So there's all sorts of issues around that, and we get into a whole, other area. I mean, I suppose it's an easier way of having the recorder in your pocket syndrome if you were going into a meeting, but I think it's quite interesting as far as that's concerned. Another question I've got here as well, sort of changing tack a little bit, and we talk about different areas of risk that might come up going forward. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of talk in the industry and in society generally at the moment about net zero, and the whole area of environmental risk. I think will be of increasing importance going forward. I mean, in your experience, are construction firms taking all the steps that they need to take to identify those environmental risks? And also, do you think that's starting to feed through to the kind of projects that they'll even consider working on in the future, where they would, just now turn down stuff that actually isn't going to benefit the environment? And what's your thoughts on that, Bill? First of all, the whole area of environmental risk you know, when we have a society being a lot more, you know, sort of keen on net zero?
I think so, and I think from a contracting point of view, a lot of contractors like to be associated with those sort of things. I mean, there's a lot of decent sized, you know, good projects which bring good PR as well, and I think that's terrific to see. I mean, I'm a believer that we're moving in the right direction. I mean, I just read a couple of days ago that in fact I think renewables, it was one of the first days that renewables overtook all the other traditional types of power supply, and that's telling us that we are moving in the right direction. And without a doubt, I think as an industry, we really ought to be very, very proud of that, because we're very much at the forefront. When you see a lot of these turbines being erected, etc., a lot of it is really, really good technology that's come from the construction industry. So yes, I think we should be very, very proud of the contribution that we're making in this area.
Thanks, Bill. Andy, are you seeing, I mean, because obviously you see contracts all the time, are you seeing more greener projects coming forward as a result of that?
Yes and no. I've got a few top 10 clients, UK top 10 engineers, architects, who in their own ways have got specific design packages that are achieving carbon neutral, and they're very powerful in their sector, so they lead the kind of design attitude within the construction industry. They are rare, though, I would say. I think most people on this call would agree that it's the money men and the clients dictate down what the kind of culture is on the project, unfortunately. So I wouldn't say outside of that I'm seeing much more greener projects necessarily, or even terms in contract, apart from perhaps public sector, because obviously the government has a handle in that. I think as we go forward, achieving net zero needs stakeholder input from everyone, client down. I think there needs to be better regulation or a impetus from the government to make it worthwhile, profitable wise for companies. I know in Australia, for example, they have I can't remember the details of it, but house builders have a very, very keen bonus, let's call it, if they build houses that are sustainable. And there is a lot of positivity around providing the green badge that I can't remember what they call it out there. We need something similar in the UK. I don't think BREEAM and other things are strong enough, and it's often just used as a kind of tick box exercise rather than anything else. But like I say, there is these few clients I've got are attempting to push in the right direction with the design power that they've got. But I still certainly think more needs to be done.
Thanks, Andy. Jenny, in terms of some of the clients that you work with, are you detecting a sort of move towards people wanting to work on those greener projects, and how do you advise your clients who are working on potential projects that might potentially cause some harm, or at least be seen to cause harm?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's the whole net zero agenda and everything that's happening around COP26 coming to the UK, and the climate emergency as well. It's definitely something that every organisation across all different sectors is looking at and making sure that its business is aligned to it, its objectives and strategies aligned to it, and that any risks are either factored in, or on the other hand, they're looking to take advantage and reposition their business to be absolutely on the right side of how it sees the debate unfolding. And that includes looking at new technologies, or looking at retrofitting, or whatever it is, making sure that every kind of stone has been overturned to look at and consider what they're doing. In terms of managing risky projects for it, I think for most organisations, the advice of that is always, if what you're considering doing and if the area that you're looking at focusing it at aligns to your business objective, and if you can take a view that you've measured up the risk and you're doing what you're doing, you then need to be communicating as early as you can with your stakeholders and setting out the reasons for why you're doing what you're proposing or what you're considering, and then how you are going to personally manage any risk that you've identified that come along to it. So again, it all goes back to early doors communication, making sure that you're moving along that journey with your stakeholders, and that you're not just coming to them right at the last minute and saying, hey, this is what we're planning, what do you think about it?
Thanks for that, Jenny. Got a question from one of our attendees, and I think this is probably aimed at Bill. You touched on risk modelling for quantitative analysis, and they ask what sort of attributes are used to create a model in the legal and insurance sector for that. What is actually being modelled in order to provide that risk model in that particular area? I mean, is that something you can reflect on, Bill? And if not, I'll move to...
Are we talking about T's and C's then? Are we talking about terms and conditions, do you think, being embedded in?
I'm not entirely sure from the question. They just said risk modelling for quantitative analysis. You know, what sort of attributes are used to create a model in the legal and insurance sector?
Well, I'm more than happy to touch on sort of what we do. I mean, maybe Sheena and Andrew and Jenny can expand on that. But certainly from a quantitative analysis, what you know, we predominantly focus on time and cost, keeping it simple. And what clients want to understand is, you know, I've got a project, here's the scope, you know, we've got a budget and we've got a program. And keeping it nice and simple as that, they then want to understand, well, look, you know, how confident are we that we're going to be within time and cost? Simple as that. And so what we would do is we would obviously facilitate workshops, we would identify the risks that could impact on that program and cost associated with it. And then we will come back with advice saying, look, in fact, your budget's going to potentially need to be this, and it's potentially going to overrun by 6 to 12 months, for example, because of all the risks that we've identified. And then we can then focus on those specific risks that may cause that extension and that increase in cost, and put the controls in place, which I talked about earlier. With regards to terms and conditions, well, that may T's and C's and insurance may then come into, because then the client may look to put a contract together associated around a number of these risks. And that's probably where Sheena and Andrew will probably sort of step in how that will be dealt with effectively. Sorry to be a bit leading there, Sheena, but
that's fine. I mean, it's a really good question actually, because I think we've all seen, as Bill's explained, on projects, we're quite used to risk registers, for want of a better word. So under the NEC regime, under FIDIC and other forms of contracts, project risk registers have been out there, and Bill's explained the kinds of overall aims of those kinds of documents. What we're increasingly advising and doing in relation to projects that may be looking a bit sort of like they're not going well, and lots of construction and infrastructure projects unfortunately don't go well, is looking at producing almost a legal risk register, and the sorts of things that we advise are included on that are any project-specific areas of concern. So they could be around client issues. You know, the client may be seen as a risk in itself. High turnover of project management staff, for example. Political risks. The fact that there may be in a jurisdiction where there are cultural differences in terms of how communications happen. Whatever it is, whether it's to do with fees not being paid on time and therefore that being a risk. But the important thing, I think, with any kind of register like that is the updates. It's actually regularly reviewing those risks and updating those risks. And certainly I found it's been a useful tool where I've been helping clients on a project that hasn't turned into a circumstance or a claim, but they need that guidance. And I found a legal risk register to be quite a useful tool to keep an eye on those risks along the way.
Andy, do you have any reflections on that briefly? Because I've got quite a few other questions I've got to get to.
I'll be very brief. I mean, essentially, your proposal form or your contractors or risk register from your insurance broker is effectively a risk model. So look at what those questions are asking. For example, many props will ask for what's the % of projects that have overrun in the last 2 years, 3 years. That's where you get the kind of information that may help. Just very briefly, we work with another organisation called Get It Right Initiative, and they are attempting to come up with an error ratio, very much like the health and safety ratio that exists in that sector. And the idea of it is for contractors to be able to calculate quantitatively, due to cost overruns and delays, like what Bill's talked about, what the rework and error ratio is on a project, and therefore their entire book of projects over a certain time. Something like that would be really useful, because then it allows people to model where they sit within a kind of benchmark, if you like, of risk, and well, certainly an area of risk, which is errors and loss that's created out of it. That's all.
Thanks for that, Andy. I've got a question here, and this is kind of moving on to clients and their attitude, and I want to get to talk, and we will talk about whether or not we are going to see some more disputes in the future as well in a minute, and I might even get on my high horse when it comes to clients in a second as well. But anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. But I had a really interesting comment in the chat, and this is around again the use of technology. And one of our audience highlights in the chat, Mike Lovegrove, and he says that he's aware of an SME firm that he knows about who uses 3D digital modeling as part of their everyday design analysis work, really. And this SME was working with quite a large traditional client, and they asked them to revert to 2D because the client didn't have the digital software or want to upgrade their systems in this new digital environment that we're actually all now working in. And they withdrew from that client as a result. They just didn't want to work with them anymore. The reason I'm raising that is from the point of view, just because we're in that digital environment, it doesn't mean that everyone can step up to the plate and work within it. And that includes clients. So how do we get, how do we manage the risk, if you like, of clients not being, basically on the case, really, in areas like that? I mean, what would your advice be to, a company who, basically wants to do the right thing, but maybe you're being hamstrung by the fact that their clients are working in a different way? And I'm going to ask that of Jenny to begin with. I mean, how... everyone thinks that everything's good about the digital thing, but obviously there's an example there where it might not be so good.
Yeah. So can I just qualify your questions to see I've got it right? So how do we advise people to understand the risks that they're facing, even in spite of some of the challenges? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think how do they take their clients with them? When they, maybe the consultant or the contractor is, if you like, is ahead of the game in terms of digital usage in this case. And maybe the client's saying, well, I'm not really sure we want to go down that route. Can't we do it in the old way, whatever? Do you know what I mean? How do we, again, I suppose it's an element of communication, really, on one level.
Yeah, I think for the starting point, it's a really good question. I think the starting point for all those things is it goes back to risk mapping, and it goes back to understanding the context and understanding the objective and the challenges. And when you understand the objective and taking the client through what it is that they're trying to achieve as the fundamental goal, and then looking at all the things that are going to get in the way, all the barriers and the obstacles to progress that are going to come in the way of that, and then drawing out specifically the digital strand, and being able to set out the risk and the risk opportunities of what will happen if we don't invest in digital resources, for instance, or if we don't do this. I think fundamentally, at the end of the day, one of the lines that works well at the moment with client management and client expectation is we can't do things as we've normally done them because these aren't normal times. So the idea that we could just have the old strategy, take it off the shelf and engage in those same ways and use or don't use digital platforms in the way that we'd like to use them is obviously redundant when we're working in a completely different way, when the challenges our communities and our end customers face are radically different from they've been before. We obviously have to approach it with a tweaked solution. It doesn't mean a completely radical solution. At the end of the day, your key messages and what you're trying to achieve is still the same. The way what you're going to say to people, the strategies that you're going to develop, they're going to look remarkably similar. It's often just the access points and the channels that will be different.
And just on that, when we're talking about client attitudes, I was going back almost to the beginning when Sheena was speaking, and she mentioned that she thought we might see clients, I'm paraphrasing here, but actually going back to their old ways and basically seeking to sort of legal recourse for for projects not being completed. I mean, surely in these unprecedented times, innovative solutions are called for. And really have been implemented by many organisations. Now, shouldn't that definitely be the case as well with things like dispute resolution? I mean, it's not in anyone's interest, is it, for litigation to be used, to settle a dispute? That's got to be a last resort, I would have thought. because, you know, at the end of the day, it's in all parties' interests to come to a successful conclusion. You know, we don't want to see construction firms go and bust, you know, for no good reason, really. You know, other than the client has decided in their infinite wisdom that they'll try and get some money back out of a situation that actually everyone's in the same boat. Now, maybe I'm being a bit naive there, but no doubt Sheena will correct me. Sheena, what's your view on that?
I mean, this is such a age-old topic in terms of why do we have so many disputes in the construction industry. You know, I could spend a whole day talking about this, but it comes down, in my view, to just the inherently adversarial nature of the industry. And that might be down to the way in which contracts are put together. It might be down to the way in which the insurance cover works. What I heard at the beginning of the pandemic was, look, we're going to do things differently. It's in all our interests to work together. And the government, along with the CIC, put out some really good guidance documents, which we were involved in producing, but they had no teeth. They were guidance documents which said, look, let's all adopt collaborative behaviours. And I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that those those behaviours haven't been shown, because one of the dangers with what I do is I always see the projects that go wrong. 9 times out of 10, they're projects that go wrong. But certainly even those in my firm that are dealing with the front end work and the contracts and putting together, you know, the procurement side of things, are saying that they're not really seeing that collaboration. They are still seeing people in their different respective corners. I'm afraid I don't really hold out hope that the pandemic is going to change that, or even indeed innovative you know, ways of working. I think it would be great if that were to happen. You know, I think at a project sort of level, that has happened with BIM, and it has happened with people collaborating on project extranets and so on. But I think, you know, we are still seeing too many disputes where contractors are looking to pass the risk on to the consultant under a D&B contract. Consultant passes it on to their subconsultant, and yeah, I can't really offer any real sort of optimistic comment on that, I'm afraid, Andy.
Well, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and obviously, you know, 30 years dealing with legal disputes will do that to somebody, but at the same time, I'd like to take a bit more of an optimistic view on this.
Yeah,
some people might say,
yeah,
unrealistic, but, you know, yeah, at the end of the day, when the government's talking, you know, issuing things like the construction playbook, and it's saying to construction, you know, we want to build, but you've got to do it in the right way, and you've got to, you know, be less adversarial, then surely it can't be beyond the wit of the clever people that we have working in our sector to actually do things in the right way. Or am I just being, you know, am I living in a fantasy land that's never going to...
If I can interject, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I think this is a cracking question about 2 or 3 years' time when we look back. You know, if you got Sheena on in a couple of years' time and asked her exactly the same question, she'd probably have a much better idea of where it went. Or sorry, you know, where it's going. But I think also, the type of contract that we've signed up to, yeah. So I think if it's a more open-ended, a more collaborative type of contract. But if you're tied into a fixed price lump sum contract, and effectively both parties have got shareholders to consider and investors, it becomes very, very difficult, because this is where you start moving towards, well, you know, the board is there to protect its shareholders and investors, and it may have no option sometimes but to have to go down the litigious route. And we don't want that to happen. But at the end of the day, that's maybe what they're duty bound to do. Now, as I say, that this will play out over the next few years. Certainly, I'm involved, very much involved on a number of public funded projects, and without a doubt, the collaboration is very, very good. The government is from my perspective, you know, the government is very, very, very clear. You know, it is tough times, and we are going to be more collaborative. When you've got two private sector businesses coming together, there may be very, very different behaviours, as explained before.
Thanks. I'm going to have to finish off now on one question for all of you, and I think that we've got a whole potential of the webinar there. But I think at the end of the day, we're dealing with people here involved in all of these projects, and I get what you're saying around businesses and everything. But I have to say, I think we as an industry have got to work differently in the future, particularly if we want to do all the things that we talk about. Solve the problems of the world. Reach the net zero targets, attract the young people into the industry to show that it's a modern, go ahead, digital, cutting edge industry. We can't be doing that if people are at each other's throats in relation to, in relation to the courts. But anyway, as I said, that's a separate webinar altogether. Final question to everyone, if you can answer it very, very briefly. We've obviously been through unprecedented 10 months. And hopefully it won't be too much longer, but this is going to continue for a while longer. What lesson do you think is there for us all to learn in the risk and issues management area, I suppose, from the 12 months of the pandemic period that we've been through? And I'll start off first with Andy from Howden. Briefly.
Big question. I think the lesson we've learned is that you can never really predict the future, and you need to be thinking ahead. I know that sounds very vague, but this is a good opportunity for me, this situation, for the industry to take stock and change the way it operates. And I agree with everything you said, Andy. The key issue for me is collaboration, work under alliancing agreements, partnerships, whatever the next fancy contract is that does the same thing. The government's behind it, public sector's behind it, therefore, and the insurance industry can be behind it in owner-controlled insurance programs that work on a single project basis. And I think we have an opportunity now with the kind of slowdown perhaps that's happened over the pandemic to really rethink about the way things go forward.
Thanks a lot for that, Andy. Bill, key takeaway for you.
So I'm going to clearly annoy Andrew, because from a risk perspective, I think we can predict the future in the sense that there are some very, very difficult questions out there. And what we've done in the past is we've parked them and we'll say we'll come back to them. Whereas I think what the pandemic has actually raised is that we need to take some of these difficult decisions head on, and we need to challenge them now. And yes, they are unlikely to happen, but when they do happen, they create such a problem, as we've seen over the last 10 months, that, I believe that we can. And I think we should challenge ourselves and take on those difficult questions a lot more.
Thanks, Bill. Sheena, give me some optimism.
I think probably the lesson that I personally have learned is the importance of people, the importance of the people that we work with, that, colleagues, and also that knowledge transfer. I think this is a challenge that we're continuing to try to address. It is, how do we train our younger staff, our graduates, our trainees, and it's a concern. I think we took for granted the ways in which we used to train younger staff, and it was learning by seeing others do it and listening in and so on. And I think for me, it's that sort of at the heart of all of what we've been discussing really is competency and education and skills. So for me, that's the main lesson, the ongoing sort of challenge as well, really arising out of this.
Thanks very much, Sheena. And Jenny, some closing observations, reflections from yourself.
I agree with everything everyone's said, unsurprisingly, so I won't repeat any of it. But I think just the only other add-on I'd have as my closing remark is a lesson which reaffirms what I already thought from a comms perspective, which is when your messages need to be completely empathetic. They need to be in tune, understanding, not lead with your concerns as an organisation, but lead with the concerns of the people that are most affected by whatever's happening around them. And if you get that, you get good comms. And if you get good comms, you have a much better chance of surviving without reputational damage. So it's about putting yourself in people's shoes and just being as empathetic and questioning and challenging yourself all the time. Am I talking in plain English? Does this make sense? Am I talking in riddles, or am I being clear and caring?
Thanks very much, Jenny. And I think that's a really important point to finish on, because at the end of the day, this is an industry that is about people, and also it's an industry that in the recent period has actually delivered, has continued to actually produce, has continued to work, And I think from that perspective, you know, I think there is grounds for optimism going forward. And I think if the government do actually come good on their promises, and I think it's a big if, but we have to give people the benefit of the doubt. And then I think there is some grounds for optimism for the industry going forward. We've run out of time, as always. I'd like to thank all of our panelists today, to Sheena, to Andy, to Bill, and to Jenny for their insights on this evolving issue and ever topical issue of risk. Big thanks as well to our partners, BCG, for their support for everything that we do. Next time, we have a very interesting webinar in a month's time on the future of cities. And if anything is going to be affected by what we've seen over the last 10 months and the future, then cities will certainly be on the agenda as far as that is concerned. And the other one, just to give a gratuitous plug for our social value and construction conference on the 26th of March. Social value is a key issue for our sector, and many people are talking about it, and we'll be talking about it at length at a special conference on the 26th of March. But that's it from us, from another Infrastructure Intelligence Live event. All that remains is for me, Andy Walker, to say thanks for tuning in, and thanks to all our panelists who will now, in the time-honoured way, wave goodbye and wish everybody a happy weekend. Happy weekend, everybody.
All right, thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.